Okay. Hello. I joined this morning. Sorry, I'm not there in Zurich. I'm in Vienna. My name is Vera Bühlmann. I used to work for a long time at Ludger's chair before I got the professorship here at Technical University in Vienna for architecture theory and philosophy of techniques, I call it. That's mainly because I am not myself an architect. So my background is also not in art history or in architecture history, but it's in language, so literature and linguistics, and in philosophy and media theory, media science. So, what I would like to talk about today is to pick up this focus on faces that you have in this semester and think the face, let's say, diffracted through the notion of the figure. And the figure has this interesting double oscillating reference, we could say, because on the one hand, it stands for a body, a figure like in sculpture, so embodied and concrete and manifest. But on the other side, it's quite close to the term of the person, which is the face, no? So the face in public. And it's about this relation I want to talk, specifically also with respect to time and history. So I will share my screen. Yeah. Can you see? Is it fine? Yes, great. Good. So this is your topic, no? One of the key sentences that I want to think about, that's why history comes in. We are all migrants, native to the universe. So it will be about, native means there is a nature to the universe. Otherwise, we couldn't be native to the universe. Yeah? The universe would be our house, or it would be our domain or something like that. The point of view I want to talk about is being migrant, so not having a home in a territorial sense, but being native at the same time to the universe. A key idea for this is to take up this notion. I don't know if you have come across it. It's quite a big thing right now. Everybody speaks of entropy. But entropy is a term from thermodynamics. So from a physics, let's say, of transformations in the 19th century specifically. Entropy has many facets of what it means, what it refers to. But what it does is it operates as a measure of disorder. A measure of disorder. And you can see the paradoxicality of the term in that. So if we can measure something, there must be an order to what we measure. No? But entropy says we can measure disorder. And how to think about this relation is, let's say, the reference of the kind of translation that is at stake with it. So this translation has often been referred to in thermodynamics as work. Work, very simply in the sense of transforming energy from one form into another. No? So let's say the hotness of a cup of coffee into the temperature of the room as it dissolves, as it becomes entropic. So it's usually referred to in terms of transformation. And my focus will be, how can we think of a notion of form with respect to this paradoxical kind of thing that entropy does, namely to measure disorder. And in order to do so, I will make references to not transformation, but translation. Translation in the sense that, like in language, it's impossible. Yeah. So a translation involves many interesting aspects. The core of it, perhaps, something like an original meaning or an original intention or a pure message or something like that. And to even assume that we have this, whether in language or in talking or in clarifying thoughts and so on, is, I would say, a rather recent hypothesis that has become popular since Enlightenment, so the last 200, 300 years, not really longer. If we let go of this idea, then translation is always active in two ways. On the one hand, it needs to enrich, so to hermeneutically decipher and read or make sense of something that is being said or written. And on the other hand, to invent how this thing that we decipher can be encrypted such that it can be transposed into another language. Yeah. So how can we capture something that is said in Chinese, for example, into German? It's difficult because the different languages have different tense structures. So how languages refer to time is not at all the same between the different languages. Yeah. So in some languages, time has more of a kind of a circular understanding. So then the past is literally distant, but distant to a center, not distant to a point on the line. So if we need to translate in such constellations, it gets very complicated. Respectively, it needs a lot of invention at the same time as being extremely literal. Yeah? So invention and literalness don't exclude one another if we take translation serious. And with this new physics that we have, not only thermodynamics, but also quantum physics, so electricity, where entropy is being multiplied and complemented with its negative. We have negentropy as one of the crucial terms in how we can think order in this way. With this, communication which translates becomes physics, physical embodiment material. So this is an interest that many people pursue now. It's one of the big, let's say, of the big discourses which calls themselves new materialism. So the new materialism basically says idea and matter, they're not two separate things. They are not the same, but they're more like something like the North Pole and the South Pole. The world is everything that spans the two poles. Yeah? So there is a little bit of the North Pole in every point of the Earth, but there is also a little bit of the South Pole in every point of this Earth. So new materialism, idea and matter, and translation. For architecture, this is interesting because a lot of the theory in architecture, especially since the 60s, in post-structuralism or postmodernism, they kind of affirmed or said that there is nothing outside of text. Everything is text, whether it's a house or a city or whatever you might have. So text becomes primary. This is not the view I want to share. So that's why I accentuate this oscillation and the translation. Because in time, so language, if we say text refers to language, language literally lives in time. No? Language needs time to be what it is, to do what it can do. With architecture, it's almost a bit like inverse. No? So either we say, well, architecture doesn't live at all, and then we go to some kind of idealism. But if we say architecture or buildings have a life of their own, as it is key, of course, for every understanding of building conservation and history and so on, then where does it live? And it lives in space, no? But here again, time and space, think of them rather like North Pole and South Pole, because language could not articulate anything with clarity if there were no space in it. And at the same time, architecture could not embody anything in space if there were no time in it. So this role of code that is oscillating and translating No, it acts a little bit like a screen does. And this notion is important. The screen is something I think that is quite genuinely fresh. I wouldn't say new. It must have constellations where it's coming from with the icons, a kind of a radiating presence. But it's new in a technical sense with the digital and with electronics. So the screen is something like an image that is radiating, no, literally. And it's also not an image. It's an imaginality or something like that. Imageness, a magnitude. So a screen is active, and this screen cannot itself belong to one of the languages between there is translation, or one of the forms of articulation between which there is transformation. So translation and screen, this is an important constellation for what I want to talk about. And I will come back to this book a bit later as well. It's a book by a philologist, Werner Hamacher. And philology is interesting because it has a lot to do with this screen and with this oscillation. It is something that studies, if you want, the genealogy or the life of words, but always in a sense that doesn't link it to an origin, but that gives it stability in constellations. So how philology works with the meaning of words has a lot to do with reading documents of the same time, and then of a comparative constellation in time. And then it's more like a saturation of what is entailed by a certain word, no? Like fields of association or something like that. And Hamacher wrote this, actually the title I think is by the editors, it's a collection of his essays, which is very nicely entitled On the Brink. We will see that the brink is a term which means, on the one hand, something like an edge, so being on the edge, but it's an edge which is at the same time subject to a kind of a material happening, like a welling, no? A welling of the sea, a raising of the waves. So there's a swelling up towards an edge. So the edge is not this clean point of eine Schwelle, no? Of an I don't even know what a Schwelle means in English, like between the door, no? A line which separates inside and outside. It's not that. It is that, but in a material sense, which doesn't fix it, because it comes from such oscillation. So on the brink, and what is it that plays together? It's language, time, history, and politics in his approach. There is one passage I want to look at as a kind of an atmospheric introduction, which is this one here. No? So you see, philology, in order to do that, like architecture, must be outside of time in a certain extent, because otherwise it couldn't deal with representations. So it must, in a way, be outside of time, but at the same time, it is active. Yeah, it is active, and this is what he calls gestures of language. And these gestures, they emerge when articulations are not just narratives in time, but also embodied meanings, let's say. So figures, figurations, motifs that persist, that are being picked up, that are being altered, that are being projected back, and so on. So then we speak of something like gestures in language. And he coined this nice word instead of, it's a mixture between, well, okay, it gets complicated. Translation in such an oscillatory sense, which becomes a transduction. So eine Überführung, not just ein Übersetzen, but also eine Überführung, a transduction. But he doubled this sense of a transduction because you can translate in all the directions, yeah. But they're not reversible. They are circular, but whether you go right or left, like Ludger was talking this morning, it matters. So whether you translate from one language back into another or forward into another, it will not be the same. And to capture this, he speaks of contraductions. And let's look quickly at how he begins to introduce this. Oh, it's not this one. Gestures of language, contradictions. So he writes, among the most delicate problems in the philosophy of language and in philology is the fact that one language can only be translated into another language by this other language itself, not by a third language common to both. There is no rational calculus of language that mediates, if translation is a mediation, between individual languages. There is no characteristica universalis and no Esperanto. For any comprehensive language would in turn only be an individual language into or from which one would have to translate. Also, it cannot be a language above languages or a composite language made by bringing together other individual languages. It is still a linguistic form, and bringing together other individual so it is still a linguistic form, and as that form in which languages transmit one another and have the sole criterion of their linguisticality, translation is the language of languages. So this is what matters. Translation is the language of languages. So what we want to, what I would like to explore, no, I haven't sorted this out myself, of course, but what I would like to explore is how we can think in an analog manner of something like the form of forms, yeah, with this, and its architectonics. So it cannot be a question of a mediating third, which would be neutral in between. This is the screen, no? The screening function. The activity of the canvas, if you want, So a projection is not only active from the author which projects, it's also active from the recipient that receives a projection. And in order to talk about that, the notion of the figure is interesting. So this is from a book which addresses the topic of the figure, interestingly, not through art history or language, no, directly, but through mathematics. It's a book entitled Figures of Thought, as they are captured through mathematics. What the author, David Reed, writes here, and this is the significant citation for our context, figure is the context in which definition and delimitation are the same thing. For to give a definition of a figure is to give its boundary, and to give its boundary is to give the figure as definition and as boundary. Yeah. So this is, I know it sounds confusing if you read this, but that's not because it's confused, but it's precisely because it entails this kind of transductive. No? So the figure becomes that which emerges out of a transductive practice. So the figure is at the same time, it's not a contradiction in the logical sense to say that the figure is both context and definition. No? But you can see on this how powerful this abstract way of thinking is, because what we have inherited in the last few decades in theory is that no, we shouldn't be idealists like the classical modernists were with the forms. We should always attend to context. We should always integrate things into its kind of social or natural or urban fabric. So we need to think form together with context. This comes out when we follow a purely linguistical text paradigm. But if we say, well, and I will come to this in a moment, we need to think of a kind of a materiality. So text is, okay, it's text. So there is an articulation in it, but it's also physics. It's also existing. Then this relation between boundary or definition or delimitation on the one hand and context that one needs in order to relativize, if you want, or to enrich the crystalline form of a definition. They play together, they play together in a formal way, such as to bring forth what we can call a figure. Yeah. And we will see now from this, how this double aspect of the figure, to be on the one hand a body, so an incorporation, no, a form of organization, like a body which has organs, and through the organs forms a kind of a metabolism, so a complex whole. There is also this other sense of making an appearance in public, because the context is already enfolded into the figure. Yeah. So a figure is never entirely private, entirely a body, but it's a body in a world. And insofar as a figure is a body in the world, the figure has a face. Yeah. And a face is a face because somebody else recognizes it as a face. Yeah. So the question that emerges from this setup, and it is really the question that has troubled a lot of information theorists and philosophers of information and technology and of quantum physics. Does such a stance not entail that thought can somehow affect its object? Yeah. This is, for us, a very uncanny idea. It's very much in contradiction to the idea of enlightenment that we have, or of modernity, where, you know, Gedanken sind frei, no? Thoughts are free. So it doesn't matter how you think. It's a private thing. Your thoughts are private. Yeah. And the object, so if you are a rational thinker, then you can clarify your thoughts in an objective way. And then this objective captured thought is not affected by you as an individual, no? But it's in general valid. So this is very much how we are used to think. And all these subtleties or these distinctions that I was talking about, they put this into question. But that's not just because it's fun to do that, no? I mean, for some people it's fun, for others it's a torture. So, but it's not for the sake of itself. It's the same question like when today, for example, if you study a little bit around philosophy of science or epistemology, there is always this question of the observer. How does the observer interact with the object he is studying or she is studying? So there is an act of measurement involved, and this measurement itself is not universally valid and neutral. A lot of the media theories, media studies are precisely about this non-neutrality of an act of measurement, which constitutes an observation, a public observation. So rather than staying within a kind of a trajectory between object and subject, can we think of this interplay like we think of translation? No? So if you make a translation, it is clear that the translation affects the original, no? Whatever it may be. It affects the original, but in the same manner, this text which is being translated genuinely affects the translation itself. No, they're not two separate things. They're not exactly the same, but they're not two separate things. So it's in this way that I want to take this question seriously. Can thought affect its object? And with this, we come to the study of time. So what role does history play? No? Because on the one hand, we can say, well, everything is thought, always. Every object is only an illusion. No? This is idealism. So we are caught up in our interiorities, which constitute our faculties to think, and we are never really in touch with reality. There's always constructions. No? So this would be the idealist point of view. Or on the other hand, when we say, no, objects are objects, but there is a history to how they came to be grasped. Yeah. There is a history to facts that happened. And this history, to a certain degree, entails interpretation. And it's clear that interpretation with regard to history is not neutral. Yeah? So that's the relation between philosophy and politics and language that Werner Hamacher foregrounds with his approach, which he calls on the brink, on the edge where things are swelling. Yeah? So something is at stake, and philology needs to, on the one hand, listen to what is swelling, but also try to keep it calm. Yeah. So, and this is a way of always, the problem with history is that one cannot really do history in the classical sense unless kind of postulating that the point of view from which one engages in history is not itself affected by history. Because if one doesn't, then one is not really doing history, but doing rhetorics. One is speaking to a certain effect with a certain intention. And when I say rhetorics, it does not necessarily mean manipulative in a bad sense. No, it has a lot to do with this thing here, branding and identity, evidently. So, on the brink, on the edge of wellings. No, if we are trying to translate in a material sense, we need to translate within one language, but we need to say this one language cannot remain pure or clear. So we need to dope it with ambiguities. No, because if you, so when you translate, you think in the language in which you have learned to think. No, we can call it a mother tongue, or we can, or it can be a technical vocabulary, or whatever it might be. But usually one stabilizes within one language, within which one translates. This is what Hamacher also described. There cannot be a third language which would help us to lift up a meaning from one language and put it into another. But we need to transform our relation to our own vernacular language, let's say, the language in which we think, in which we feel. Yeah. And in order to do that, we need to be copious in this language. And copiousness literally means, and it has a relation to the copy, so to the duplicate, but it's a different one than we usually today mean. A copy is not a precise, metrical, rational duplicate. A copy is something that is sourced out of a language that one masters in plenty. Yeah. So you're being rhetorical in language if you master it in plenty. You know that a certain idea that you want to express is more like a motif, and whether you talk about it to some people or to other people matters in how you put it. Yeah. So it's against this sterile formality of what today is called academic writing. No, it's a writing which becomes literary, but not in the sense that everything is now fiction, but it's articulated, it's crafted language, and it articulates a mastery that has a relation to one's own words that is copious, no? That knows how to paraphrase, and it knows what every paraphrase does to what one is saying. This is etymologically the sense of copia, the plenty. And interestingly, it now complements this notion of translation with a technical term, with a metrical term, namely to transcribe. You know, so to transcribe, this is this interesting thing that you can transcribe, so you can protocol what somebody says without understanding a word. Yeah, this is what the phonetic, there is an international way of writing the pronunciation of words. And if you are literate in this phonetic script, you can listen to a conversation between two people from wherever, you have no idea what they are saying, but you will be able to make a transcript of it, such that other persons which know the language will be able to make sense of what you write. So a transcription is a metrical language which is radically exterior to understanding, to meaning, to sense, and so on, and to signification in that sense. It's really a metrical script, like geometry measures, no, the volumes, the size, and so on of things. Without making statements of, when in geometry we say something is bigger than something else, it doesn't mean this thing which is bigger is better. No, it's a pure question of measurement. This is what transcription does. And copiousness introduces this into the relation between thought and writing, or thought and thinking, or speaking and writing. So to transcribe. Now, why is this important or interesting with regards to history? This is a bit of a shift now, but I hope it will become clear why I think it's important. There is a notion which is becoming, in the recent few years, again, very important in the context of so-called new humanisms or digital humanisms, or also transhumanisms. And it relates to a concept which was introduced by Karl Jaspers in the 50s, I think this was, which is called the axial age, the Achsenzeit. Yeah, the Achsenzeit. This concept was introduced in a book with the title, The Origin and the Goal of History. Yeah. And you see the problematics here, no? The origin and the goal of history. So this means we kind of place history in an abstract space that is almost like a Cartesian coordinated container. Yeah. So if we would be able to say where history is coming from and what it wants to achieve, there would be determinacy. Yeah, things would be determined. That's not what Jaspers meant with it, but he called it the axial age nevertheless. And the axial age, you can think of an axis like in a coordinate space. It grounds in a zero, yeah, in a cipher, in a zero. And what this refers to is the first century before the year zero, so before the the birth of Christ in this global established way of calendar. In the first century, and it is the time, let's see, this is, for example, one of the recent articles that begin to pick this up. And you see between facts and myths. So the axial age has a lot to do with encryption, let's say. Its inspiration is similar to what Karl says. Here I agree with the author. Du bleibst am Ursprung, Ursprung ist das Ziel. So there's a kind of a circularity which does not exclude linearity. It's more like a pulsating, no? Like a pulsating or a saturation, or we could say a day and night kind of cycle, no? Or it's a cycle which always incorporates the linearity that springs off from it. A bit like when we think of nature as that which gives birth to things, but once something is born, it means it can also die. Yeah? So it's a kind of a generative sense of it. And this idea of the axial age, it comes, what is usually meant is a concept. It is meant to name a fundamental shift in cognitive orientation that took place in various locations across ancient Eurasia around the year 500 BC. This shift is supposed to constitute a rupture with previous mythological forms of consciousness and to provide a primary basis for all subsequent developments in world history. Both the major world religions and philosophy itself have a shared origin in this period. Now, part of why this concept is becoming so sexy today, again, is of course precisely that it's not strictly European. And the other thing is that people see in it something like the roots of modernity. So you see, a modernity now is not something that starts with Renaissance or something that starts with Bauhaus, no, or with Enlightenment, but in a radical sense, modernity as the domain of history, classical. That's the relation to the axial time, because the domain of history is usually starting with written documents. So we say things belong to history if they find a written form. And this is because, of course, we do archaeology, which is also historical, but archaeology is not properly history, because it's clear that with archaeology, there is a lot of inventiveness and speculation involved, which in the study of documents through language, the historians try to reduce, no? to get rid of. So in a very classical sense, when we speak of history, we mean since the whole domain that is covered by written documents. And in this sense, it is called modernity, at the roots of modernity. Now, these roots of modernity, they're called such, or the axial age is called such, because it is really surprising and remarkable that in a very short time, 3 major inventions of cultural technology, we could say, not technology, Kulturtechniken, happened. And this is, on the one hand, the invention of money, so money as a general equivalent. On the other hand, the alphabet, so the phonetic script. And the third one is theoretical mathematics. So mathematics, which is not directly embodied in tools, but which opens up this whole space of Theoria, of something like eine geistige Schau, no? So an abstract contemplation of something which is not here, but which allows us to handle things which are here in different ways, like the currents of water, when we learn with the principle of the pump, how to make it go uphill, for example. So mechanics. So theoretical mathematics, the phonetic script, and the phonetic script is the script which allows for transcriptions. So one can write without understanding what is being said. And the third one, money. Money can mediate processes of exchange. Yeah? These 3 things were invented in several places in more or less the same time, but in a very dense period around the year 500 BC. And it's because of this coincidence. So this, let's say, he calls it a fundamental shift in cognitive orientation. No? A fundamental shift in cognitive orientation. This he calls the point of the axis of modernity, so the roots of modernity. Because with that, we could, think and do cultural processes, including agriculture, but not only, in a more abstract way. And the point is, and that's why the concept is becoming important again today, that a lot of people say with the digital, we have something similar. It's like a new axial age that is happening, because with the digital, we literally transform sound into picture, smell into temperature, objects into diagrams, whatever you want. So across all the measurement categories that were established, we can transduce or translate or transcribe in the digital. Because the digital refers to electricity, and electricity is quantum physics. So there is one image, I don't think I prepared a slide for that, but it helps me to grasp what that means best. No? So electricity has a lot to do with light and with energy. And very literally, we can think of the sun in this sense, because the sun is giving energy, no? It's not photovoltaics, it's the is the technology that copies what the sun does, or what forms of organism, what plants do in the sun. But the sun sends energy, but it's also pure light. So it's at the one and the same time, the sun is the body of the largest mass in a galaxy and immaterial, pure light. Yeah. And we have again a kind of a contradiction here, or a paradox that is embodied in a certain way. So this is the axial age. And now, the way what I want to do with it, with this translation of, with this introduction of the figure, translation and transduction. The problem with the concept as it was introduced by Jaspers and also in its discussion here, is that it literally puts the domain of history in a kind of a Cartesian analytical space where you can construct with it. No? And we all know if we construct something, it's not history, it's a construction, it's an agenda. This has had, yeah, a complicated reception in the 20th century, both in the sense of becoming very hostile against technology per se, but also in the sense of fancying the design of the next people, no? Let's say, to put it drastically. So what we can instead say is, if we have a coding perspective, this point in time, let's say, where these three techniques, so money, which doesn't exist, but evidently does a lot for our world, the phonetic script, so how to relate to language without, in a metrical way, not through understanding, and also theoretical mathematics. So mathematics that does not have as its goal to optimize a certain application of a tool. These three things we can refer to them as a key date, ein Schlüsseldatum. This is how Michel Serres does it. We will come back to this. And if we say it's ein Schlüsseldatum, we don't have this Cartesian space which is centered in one point of origin, in the zero, im Ursprungspunkt des Koordinatensystems, but rather we can say, now there are codes that relate to this point of zero. So there are keys to decipher anything that is imaginable in that space. So then we have, instead of an Achsenzeit, an axial age, we have key dates, Schlüsseldaten. And this gives us a really interesting optics, we could say, to think about this oscillation between time and space, architecture and language, text and nature, new materialism, and so on. It is important that to think about time and history like this is not something one should take very lightly. No? So yeah, we are not in a game world here. It's not, so things have it's of enormous consequence of how we think of this. And this doesn't mean we shouldn't think in these directions, but it means we should take it very serious. And to understand or to grasp a bit more what it entails, I want to show you from another book which also makes translation primary by Georg Steiner. He calls it After Babel, Aspects of Language and Translation. I want to show you what is entailed if we think of history and of time in its relation to language like that. There is one passage here where he talks about how the different languages give us different grammatical tenses to think about time, no? Because grammatical tenses are the forms through which we think about time in language. So let's read this maybe to not be too unverbindlich with what I'm saying. Far more difficult to establish than the history of the analytic formal treatments. And here with analytic formal treatments, you can think of a Cartesian space. No? It's an entirely analytical domain. So far more difficult than to think of history in such a sense and that means also of futurity, is the history of actual human futures and optatives. Optatives are now like when we say something is an option. So things which are not really necessary, but also not superfluous. So it's an option, eine Möglichkeit. But an option is more than a possibility because an option needs to be taken. A possibility is somehow has a life of its own. But if we say there's an option, it means there's a possibility in relation to those for whom it is a possibility. So the history of actual human futures and optatives. As I noted before, we have no such history and only problematic notions of what its documentation and evidence would be like. Yet the probability that substantive changes have taken place in the psychological and social conventions governing the future tense, also die Zukunftszeitform, in the ways in which different cultures have articulated inductive or premonitory speech acts is very strong. Futures play a major role in so this is now an example. I don't want to make this too long, no, but a very striking example. Futures play a major role in the tenseless syntax of the Hebrew Old Testament, where tenseless simply refers to a grammatical system in which past, present, and future are not distinguished and demarcated as they are in non-Semitic grammars, such as Greek and Latin. Timeless, but enunciated in time. And here you have, again, a history of a paradox relation. Timeless, but enunciated in time. The words of God mesh closely, but also strangely, with the understanding, with the historical self-identification of a people, itself committed to a special eschatological temporality. Early on, a critical distinction seems to have been drawn here between two orders of foresight, of projection into the future. I just want to give you indexes. No, I cannot explain all this to you, but it's important that we pay attention that this is so. Somehow like this. No, I'm not saying Georg Steiner has it totally precise, but he is indexing, let's say, a virulent topic that is not over, yeah? that haunts us, some would say. So how to relate to future and time. Okay, I think it gets too detailed. To put it drastically, what conflicts in the tense structures, for example, that he addresses here between the Hebrew Old Testament language and Greek and Latin, for example, is something which is in parallel to a distinction between the Old and the New Testament, where very literally the word is in the beginning, but the word articulates in the Old Testament the law spoken by God, no? Which doesn't have which is not part of history. Whereas in Christianity, with the New Testament, Christ embodies, it incarnates time of the world. You see, these are aspects which translation kind of needs to face. So the publicness of a face, of a body of thinking has to do with things like this, which cannot be decided unless one takes party, no? But the beauty of the perspective of code, of transduction and translation is that we don't decide. We try to preserve, we try to enrich, we try to speak in a way that people can relate to within a domain of fuzziness and of arbitrariness even. That will be the responsibility of the translator. Yeah? So the interest is, can we, through this physics which we have today, not begin to translate between such dominant ways of thinking, ways of feeling, ways of being, like the different religions have in relation to each other. So the axial age is a problematic hypothesis because it kind of suggests that there could be a neutral space that allows for such translations. And of course, this neutral space is very much a Christian idea. So this goes too far now to elaborate, but many people are wondering and writing about the proximity of Western science and Christianity. So it is one of the key motifs in all the post-colonialist discourses, in discourses where people insist on preserving indigenous values and so on. It's always about this relation that we have with our analytical understanding of science and history and Christianity, which has something to do with precisely this. Which is why Michel Serres, a very dear philosopher to me, who was thinking a lot about both information theory, communication philosophy, the relation between natural and human sciences, has written a lot. His response to this thesis of history as an axial history, no? Because the promise of axial history is, of course, that it says, well, there is something which is common. No? Here as well, what is common is scripture. So written language is what unites the two, but the way to treat it is what separates them. So the axial age is this hypothesis that says there are things that allow a certain unity between very different cultures, at least to the extent that we dare to engage in the attempt to translate. So he kind of formulated what you could call the negative. So like if the axial age is something like the entropic view of the distinctions of the different religions or worldviews, then what he called la guerre mondiale, so the world war, or a war that is the world, is something like the negative pole to that. And what he articulates here, so he says, if we introduce a counterpole to this pole of the axial age, then we can think the abstraction to it. And the abstraction to it, he calls it l'arche-monde, so the arche-world. The arche-world, so not the beginning of the world, but an understanding of the world, which is at the beginning of putting an axial age and its opposite into relation. What comes from this is what he called récits d'humanisme, and this is in the plural. You see, it's not the history of humanism. It's not a notion of universal humanity which would flow together in one history. But there are accounts, many accounts of humanisms. And the table of contents of this book is like this. No? So all of these accounts, all of these récits d'humanisme, they are fragments of what he calls un grand récit. They are fragments, and as such, they constitute the social. So the I, the us, and the anybody or everybody. So these become, rather than saying we design now, we construct a political state or a society in such an analytical domain of an axial age, what we figure out is the subjects of it, and the subjects on different scales, on an individual scale, on a collective scale, and also on a total scale. And from the combination of these fragments, there are different stories of how to think of the nature of the human. This whole approach has a next step, no? Because this here it relates history to the social, not to nature. No? What can it say about nature? The aspect which answers to this is a book which is not written by Michel Serres. It was the catalogue to an exhibition, but it uses this approach of Michel Serres to think about today's astrophysics, no? Le grand récit de l'univers. What it does is it takes serious. No? So when we say time is an absolute magnitude, so we have light speed. What light speed refers to is the heaviness of certain atoms, and the heaviness of the atoms is an indicator to these atoms' early appearance after the Big Bang. Yeah. So all the constants with which our physics today articulates the nature of the universe is somehow in relation to the Big Bang. This hypothesis of a beginning of the Earth, of the universe. But the Big Bang in that sense is a notion like a key date. It's like the cipher, we could say, to which other key dates can relate. So rather than having this one Achsenzeit, this one axial age, there can indeed be many axial ages that come with cultural, with technical, with mathematical developments, but they all articulate or index a common reference, which is literally the beginning of the universe. And what the Big Bang stands for is a metrical way of relating to this. No? So the Big Bang, strictly speaking, doesn't say there was no creator, but it says as far as science can say something about it, we start with the Big Bang. And what was before, science cannot really say something about it for now. Yeah. So in this sense, there is a nature to the universe. And this nature, I mean, it literally, so stars have an age, no? We know that even suns, they are born and they die. No? Planets are born and die. So the stellar bodies are not eternal. We know that they have a physics, and we understand quite a lot about its physics. But that does not mean we can exhaustively explain it. That's the distinction that I want to take care of. And this is also in this term, le grand récit de l'univers. So it's not the history of the universe, but it's different récits. So different, it's always this term récit, how to translate it. No, most people would translate it as a story or as a narrative, the grand narrative, like Lyotard was saying, it can no longer exist. No, with the postmodern, you've probably heard of that. It's one of the very strong statements about the postmodern condition in which we are living, where François Lyotard said, there can no longer be any grand narrative, so keine großen Erzählungen mehr. But what Michel Serres does with this is to say, well, astrophysics gives us a grandness, so a magnitude of the account which we give of nature. But it's this grandness or this magnitude is a physical magnitude. It's not a moral one. It's not like a superstructure or a dominant paradigm, but it's simply in terms of magnitude. Just like if we measure geometrically, a large triangle is not better than a small one. Yeah? Whereas when we say a large king, we clearly say it's better than a small king. So again, this metrical point of view. But then it also has the aspect of a story, no? And this story comes from this understanding. It says, so we should not study texts, we should study the world. No? If you open the fables, for example, of La Fontaine, you will never read only the cicad and the ant or the wolf and the lamb. But if you break the stone that your foot in front of you pushes, okay, this is, I must say, a Google translation. So don't take the translation very serious, but it gives you, it points to what he is talking about. In every stone that your foot pushes, the whole universe is written in it. Yeah. From a physical point of view, this is actually true because it is a material. Materials like energy cannot be annihilated. It can become useless. But the amount of energy in the universe is always the same. That's the starting point for thermodynamics to think with. So there's a conservation. The universe is something that conserves the energy which circulates in it. So in every little object, the whole universe has written itself into. Human, our stories, talkative, tell only brief anecdotes. A few millennia barely pass in our history books. Well, that's what I was talking about with the written documents. For them, silent, so the stones, they are silent. They don't talk, so they're not written. They are silent but there is a colossally long memory. The things of the world go, okay, this is a terrible translation. Why? So the point is that everything incorporates memory of the universe. So we can decipher from this memory. That's the point of view. And that's why it still gives us a récit, no? So many accounts, not one line, not one explanation, but many accounts, stories. And stories in the sense that the outcome is contingent. Yeah. So the axial age, that's what it proposes. Again, to sum up, the axial age considered as a key datum, ein Schlüsseldatum, where the 0 point or the point of origin is treated as a cipher with respect to which we can, and we have invented codes that allow to decipher it in many different ways. Now, our topic is the figure, no? The figure and the face, because both of them live in time. And the question is, what kind of time? How can we think of this time? Yeah. So the one of the mottos always of the studios, and this comes from a book we wrote on the quantum city. Now we are all migrants native to the universe. So we want to think of the figure relative to time in such a sense that every figure is a migrant. So we are figures, but figures are migrants, but they're also native. So they have a nature, and yet they are mobilized. Now, how do these things play together? And this emphasis on memory, so that every rock, every pebble, everything which exists embodies, so figures. No, a little bit of the universe figures in everything. That's the idea. In every object that exists, a little bit of the universe figures. And not just in appearance, but in the temporality that it organizes. And then the question is, well, how can we have an active relation to such figures? Because we usually relate to figures through vision, through sight. No, we see them. When we hear, we don't really, there is not much figurative about hearing. No, we can be attentive to figures through hearing, of course, but then it doesn't matter that they're figures that much. So the figure has a relation to vision, but it's a vision now which so when we literally begin to study, no, like the age of some rocks, no, whether they are a meteorite, for example, or not. What we need is instruments, measurement instruments. But these measurement instruments, they are the instruments of an optics. And an optics is the science, if you want, the science of vision. But the science in the sense that it gives instruments. So it doesn't explain why we see and how we see. It treats the fact that there is vision in an instrumental manner. And there is a text by a very remarkable person. He died about 10 years ago, Ivan Illich. And I recently came across an archive of lectures that he gave. And one of these lectures was entitled The Scopic Past and the Ethics of the Gaze. So with regard to the past, through language, no, the thing is, when we have objects, we are in archaeology, and we need to decrypt these objects. So in principle, we do something similar in archaeology. No? We try to read it, the memory that is preserved in it. But we do this through, or how can we do this in a way that involves materiality, not just appearance and form, but the physicality of it. So this is what he calls scopic, a kind of a scopic past. And then how does such an instrumental way of relating to the past involve something as intimate as a gaze? A gaze is a very intimate thing. So you don't study something, you don't observe something when you gaze. When you gaze, there is a mixture of feeling, of dreaming, of wishing, of hoping, of all kinds of psychological facets in play together. How can such a scopic past that would study the memory, the objective memory in things, through a kind of an intellect or an intuition which is very intuitive, which is very intimate, and intimate, yeah. So we will see how this, what we can do with this for rethinking the public and the private in the end of the lecture. For now, the scopic past and the ethics of a gaze. What he means by it, he puts it very, very simply. Actually, he says we want to treat a perceptual activity as a historical subject. There are histories of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, of the formation of a working class in Great Britain, of porridge in medieval Europe. We ourselves have explored the history of the experienced female body in the West. This was another book he wrote. And that's also important. Ivan Illich was a Catholic priest, but quite an anarchist. So he was, he wasn't expelled, he left church and lived as an intellectual and wrote really some of the most insightful books about very contemporary problems like energy and gender versus sex and vision and perspective and history, but always in a way to reconnect with the theological past, not to reanimate the theological past, but to bridge between these things. So here it's about making an active subject out of the perceptual activity. So the perceptual activity is something that is generic to at least every human being. Perhaps things do it as well, but we don't go there now. So, but for every human person, perceptual activity is something generic, but now this generic activity itself changes over time and is active in how it does so. So it evolves, if you want. How can we think this? The action of seeing is shaped differently in different epochs. We assume that the gaze can be a human act. Hence, our historical survey is carried out sub specie boni. We wish to explore the possibilities of seeing in the perspective of the good. This is what sub specie boni means, in the perspective of the good. So here you have the theological commitment. He doesn't want to expose, to be critical through exposing and accusing, but there is a conciliatory, there is an integrative vector to how he speaks. This hasn't changed. So, and in order to do this, he asks about something abstract like perceptual activity as an agent, a historical subject. So in what ways is this action ethical? The questions arose for us when we saw the necessity of defending the integrity and clarity of our senses, our sense experience, against the insistent encroachment of multimedia from cyberspace. So the question or the background to ask about such an affect, an optics of affect, you could also say. No? So the optics would be, because it's generic, perceptual activity, it's not your sensibility, no? It's as such, perceptual activity as such. So how to treat it instrumentally? Because through treating it instrumentally, one can study its agency. Yeah, okay. I just want to give you the index to this and maybe say that it's extremely relevant, especially for architecture and art, because by discrediting the centrality of perspective, not by multiplying the centrality, no, but by inverting it, by inverting perspective, that means how something appears to you objectively, inverting it into from representation into optics. Yeah, so from perspective to optics. Perspective is with the subject, optics is with the object. So to objectify a subjectivity, this is what he proposes to do here. And this gives a very different way of relating to the history of architecture, to its treatises, to its manifestos, to its masterpieces, to its canons, to the notion of the canon itself. Yeah. So because the canon has a great relation to the figure. But we don't go there. But I want to give you the indexes to this. So this scopic past, the turn to optics, is very interesting and very promising today. And the objectivity thought has something to do with our digital reality. No? Our digital reality. So it's a way of, if you want, of attending to what is now so fashionable when people say we live in a post-truth era and all of these polemics. No? But if people accuse our time, our media, to be post-truth, they believe that if only people are honest, it would be over. Yeah. But if we say, no, there is a new physics of light in the digital, it's not a question, it's a question of how can we rethink and reconnect with the notion of truth, not how does some journalist from NZZ or from Spiegel or whatever, how can he be brought to reason in order to do it properly? No, it's not a social decision like that, but it becomes a question of the instrument and of the technique and of the technicality. So this is why I think it's very promising and interesting to go there. Yeah, this is a question of how this memory, how we can think of that. I mean, archaeologically, usually what we study is the traces of actions that humans have done upon things. So how has pottery evolved in a certain time? And then we date it to a historical epoch. Or what were the motifs displayed on amphoras or something like that. But the way that Michel Serres is opening, and this is important if we are all migrants native to the universe, is not in a cultural historic sense only, but in a physical sense, in a natural sense. And one way to think of this is via DNA. No? So it's a very drastic a quote which applies not only to animate beings, but also to inanimate things like rocks or like water. No? So everything in physics has DNA. Ludger mentioned it in the morning. No? The human DNA is, what did you say, more than 60% not human. So not human means there are minerals in it, there is physics in it. It's not life versus matter. So what he says is my brain is composed of ancient parts, reptilian, of others as new as those chimpanzees or bonobos would develop. And then furthermore, with parts that are incomparably much more recent. As such, my DNA appeared, of course, with the conjunction of my parents who built it as one shuffles cards. But in its own structure, it is more than 3 billion years old. 3 billion years, this is the estimated appearance of life forms in the universe, or on Earth, at least. Or even older. The atoms that compose both it and me go back to the fabrication of hydrogen and carbon from the galactic energy of the universe. So what kind of notion of code is at work in life? So that's in a way the question with regard to all of these approaches. This we skip and just come back to this idea, no, that how we started with translation, transduction, philology, and then this notion of the brink, to be on the edge. But it's an edge which is neither a geometrical, so it's the edge of a figuration, we could say. Yeah? The etymology of the term, makes this gives a nice field of associations for this. And it's these two things I want to relate. No, so figure and brink. So where does the figure live? In what time does then the figure live? So if figure is, let's say, the result of a figuration, then this figuration entails an embodiment, but also an intellectual reflection of it. So then with this, we come back to face and body. So, and in between, there is this moment of a brink, of an edge that is a welling. So otherwise, yeah, there would be construction and not figuration. And how we can think of this, there is one particular person writing about art, but not in any way a classical art historian. It's an Indian, I believe, Ananda K. Komaraswamy. I don't know how to pronounce this. It's a book which is entitled Figures of Speech or Figures of Thought. And the passage I want to foreground in order to think this relation, no, between a kind of an edge that is a welling, a swelling, and figuring as an embodiment and also a radiating face, no, a screening face. Is this old sense of a copy? Again, copy or a likeness. So his point is that no, art, many people today think, okay, art was always trying to mimic nature until it became abstract in the 20th century. I'm making this very drastic and very schematical, but there is a lot about this. So people don't like to be figurative, for example. There's hardly any figurative sculpture today. No, it's always abstract installations of constellations of things. So the figurative, the figure, seems to stand in an uneasy relation to modernity or modernization. But if we consider the term of, yes? Okay. If we consider the term of a copy that is at work in every representation. A representation means it's not a singular appearance, it's something that can be repeated, that can be taken to the front and put up there again. So a representation involves a model, but then the model of what? Yeah. And in art, it has usually been a model of, so the model becomes a copy of something. And then the question is, a copy of what? And to this he says, no, it's a likeness. So then this copy is a likeness, but the likeness can be very diverse. Yeah. What is traditionally meant by likeness is not a copy, but an image akin and equal to its model. In other words, a natural and adequate symbol of its referent. So the representation of a man, for example, must really correspond to the idea of the man. So in the beginning, I raised this question, can thought affect its object? No? And this notion of likeness is one way of dealing with this question. So the representation of a man in art, for example, must correspond to the idea of the man. Now, if neither a man that could be represented nor an idea of the man are clear, no? Let's say there is a language of an idea of a man and the language of a man, and you are translating between. You establish likenesses which are they're not absolute. It's not something it's not the photorealistic picture is the best copy. With this, but how it is thought becomes constitutive for such likenesses that are established. And such likenesses are established by figures of speech, because figures of speech help us to think figuratively. So they convey figures of thought. To think this relation, no? A figure which is context and definition. The definition of a figure gives boundary, but to give a boundary gives a definition to the figure. So the figure is related to such likeness. And now if we think of this relation, no? A man needs to be represented corresponding to the idea of a man. We can reconnect with an old understanding of figurative art or art, that becomes very interesting because it becomes very discretionable. So then with the figure, we have an interplay between body and face, but we also have an interplay with regards to surfaces and undergrounds, and then in between an interface. No? And these are all terms which are very important. Yeah, I mean, interface is the key term in all technology. No? But paradoxically, and that's where the architectonic interest lies, in technology, the interface always strives to be seamless. So an interface is well designed if you don't notice it. If it immediately facilitates your natural quests, you need to find where to do what. And the figure, no, if we say everything, so everything contains memory of the universe. That means gives us key to decipher who we are, yeah, or what we want, or what we did, or what things are and did and want. Then everything becomes not only immediate, but it also has interfaces. So there is an interesting new domain that is not strictly territorial and that does not belong to one time only, but that can translate between temporalities. And similarly, you have an interplay of this. So cosmos, world, earth, landscape, city. You could say they are all kind of in a relation of modeling to each other. Earth and landscape, world and cosmos are actually, so cosmos means world. The notion of the world is a translation of cosmos. But the city and the cosmos have a model relation as the earth and the landscape do. Or here the face and the interface have a relation, like the surface and the body figure perhaps do. So so how can we think this action, this what I in the beginning what I called this oscillation that code does, no? This oscillation that code does. I picked this constellation because there was a beautiful book recently also about this same philosopher that I was talking, Michel Serres, which is also called Figures of Thought. And what it does is work with an analogy between these two diagrams. So it says classically, he calls it the false dichotomy of cosmos and chaos. It's false because classically we thought chaos is meaningless and cosmos is pure absolute meaning. He puts this in relation to how we thought about noise and message. And he calls this also the false dichotomy of message and noise. So noise is meaningless, message is pure absolute meaning. Now what he does, that's what he means with figures of thought. He says both. Cosmos is absolute meaningless and chaos is absolute meaningless. And in the domain that translates between chaos and cosmos, there is only figuration. Yeah? And then this figuration becomes the object of communication. But what this approach of the figure does not take into account is something like this, no? It's the memory and the history. So it is a formal abstraction. It is a formalist way of thinking, precisely in the sense that it doesn't approach it through its physics, but its formality. And for architecture, this embodiment is very crucial. No? So the embodiment of these things. Now I want to show you, give you in order to close this train of thought, this cosmos of indexes. I want to show you how these topics are at play in architecture theory since a long time. So how to think this embodiment, not just formalistically as a figuration in terms of form, but materially, physically. Let's first go to, let's say, its culmination of such formality, no? Which lives in the symbolic. So the form of form has something to do with the symbolic. What do you call this? Yeah, the symbolic. And the symbolic is self-sufficient. No? A symbol is a whole sign. It's a sign which is not really signifying because it's whole. It doesn't need to make sense because it is what it is. It's a tautology. And this understanding of the symbolic has a long history in politics and in religion, obviously. But in politics, there is one book which is very interesting because it foregrounds this. It's called The King's Two Bodies. It's a book which studies monarchy or the symbolism of a kingdom from the point of view of this body and head relation. So the king is the head, it's the crown actually, of the corporate body, which is the people. But the king has, as a symbolic institution, a very strange form of existence. You know, when the king dies, everybody says, long live the king, because every instantiated king is just a vicar. It's a vicarious placeholder for an institution which is entirely symbolic. So this is the self-sufficiency of the symbolic, which is in a very tense, it's at odds, if you want, with history, with time that passes, with aging, with the nature, with being born. This is a classic that I think is important for everyone to look at one time during their studies. It relates, or it makes the relation between, through the symbols, between theology and politics. You have the same kind of vicarious relations also in governments of any sort, no? So the Beamtenstatus is a similarly vicarious institution. So the form of form becomes political, governmental, and impossible in such a formalist continuity, where you have everything between meaningless and meaningless, because these things inscribe, so they inscribe themselves. In architecture, it's a bit similar, like the two bodies of the king. This here is a book written by Indra Kagis-McGeevan about these first 10 books of Vitruv. No? And she says, she studies the 10 books in terms of architecture is writing the body of architecture. So architecture itself is theoretical, but then the architectures that are being produced, they are the body that figures out of what people think architecture is. What she studied on historical documents then is to say, well, Vitruv, was working for Augustus, so it was about establishing the empire, the Roman Empire. So really building the body of Augustus, of the symbolical emperor. And then she declinates, what does it mean if we think of this body of Augustus, of the Roman Empire, which at the time of Vitruv had not yet been there. Yeah. If we look at it as an angelic body, or as a Herculean mythic body, or as a beautiful body, or as the body of a king. She does a kind of a speculative archaeology. So she studies documents, let's say artifacts around this time that we know were important in the work of Vitruve, and she speculates about these acts of figuration by suggesting that architecture is not so much about writing an encyclopedia, or building an encyclopedia, but building a body. So becoming natural, that's what she is looking for. It's an interesting book. I don't agree with the overall lines that she wants to foreground, but it gives you imagination of the gesture, of such gestures of thinking figuratively. The point of view that I would be more concerned, so she's about how to write the body of architecture. And we do have a body of architecture. No? The question then can be not how do we create it new? How are we original in architecture? So not this modern question, but how can this body start to become inventive? No? So to say the body is given, how can we inhabit it such that it can become inventive? And for that, there is a relation to, so body and head must play together, of course. If it doesn't, if there is no embodiment, this is another document I want to show you with the focus of these topics, is a notion of the absolute face, if you want, or the face of capital. So, because if there is no body, we have a reign of power through capital. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in their books Mille Plateaux attended to this and wrote a very powerful chapter, which you see here. The year zero, faciality. In it, they bring into resonance and communication many of the things that I was also talking about. So we have black holes, we have physics, we have white wall, white canvas, we have an abstract machine. No? So if a face is just public and not expressive of an interiority, it becomes like an abstract machine. Then how are the relation between body, head, and face and landscape? Then the year zero, no, the face and Christ, the very interesting chapter on where the face is, what does it mean to face, no? So to confront, what does it mean to have a profile and so on. Always in relation to capital as a kind of an abstract body that works machinically. So this is very interesting if you leave away the body aspect, no? And that means also the architecture. And then what I want to end with is again Michel Serres, who with his abstraction from the axial age into a key data, so ein Schlüsseldatum, has the following relation to these topics. He says, so this figuration is neither only head or body, but there are different totalities that play together. He distinguishes three totalities in response to this question of where does a figure live? So in what kind of time does a figure live? Where does figuration take place? And he says there are three totalities, one of religion, one of philosophy, and one of science. And then he says, these three totalities, they touch each other, they permeate each other, they comprehend each other. Global oceans, each of them is a global ocean, but also local seas. But everywhere, one and the same fluidum, with a tangle of strömungen, of currents, no? With a tangle of currents. So it's a mixture between, it's not chaos versus order. It's again, chaos and order in an abstract model like the North and the South Pole, and everything on the Earth which spans between them has a little bit of both in them. It's such an understanding that he is proposing with regard to this key date. So the axial age is die Achsenzeit und das Schlüsseldatum. So where money, alphabet, and theoretical mathematics were invented. And these three, they stand for the general equivalent for ciphers and for code. Yeah. And his book, which is the last book he wrote, he called it an essay on religion. You see an architectural picture, because what he calls das Verbindende for Serres was architecture. He didn't try to separate architecture against other forms of art or against science or something like that. But the thinking which works with such a coding, ciphering relation through times, this is what we can think of as architectonic. So it is concerned with governance, but not in a territorial way like a state or an institution. And now what he says is, instead of having one point of origin and the axial system, like in a Cartesian space, we have relations that go vertical and we have relations that go horizontal. And they are tense with each other. No? So this means what in a moral sense is called the problem of evil. It can never be made to go away. So his understanding of communication, therefore, is also that of the parasite, no? Which with the parasite and the symbiont. It's a bit like the pharma, what is it called? The pharmacon in Derrida. So it's a substance which can heal you, but it can cure you. So they're not properties, but these things are coexisting. So the cipher and the code is establishing standards and keeping hidden at the same time. And there can be no total elucidation because there's an interplay of several totalities. And these several totalities, they form something like scales or keys. No? So a kind of a harmonics, but harmonics doesn't mean to go from chaos to order. It means to play the two as an instrument. And in order to do so, public and private are important. Figure is somehow in the middle of it. We can go towards canon or we can go towards individualism. We cannot have a face without the body, and we cannot have a body without having a face. These were my thoughts I wanted to share. Thanks for listening. Comments or questions?
Thank you, Vera.
I will just speak here. It's a rather peripheral question to the axial age, because I've heard the term before, but more so in the context of axial age religions. And I think it comes to mind probably Christianity and maybe also Buddhism, since it's also falls in this 500 BC to 0 time frame. But what are there other examples of axial age religions?
Yes, I mean, that's for this, the thesis of the axial age is best known for. No, so the interpretation that in this time span around the 5th century, basically all the monotheist religions kind of emerged more or less the same time. And monotheist religions is now in the sense of religions that take scripture as their form of communication. So it's the Old Testament, it's Hebrew, it's also Greek philosophy, it's Christianity, not yet, it comes later, no? With the New Testament. But also, yeah, but I'm not, so I never trust, because Zoroaster, I don't know enough about it, no? But from what I know, Zoroastrianism is very old, and then Indian, so I don't trust the religious. I see that the hope to find a kind of a common constitutive through this form of abstraction, which co-emerged with the cultural technique, so with writing, with mathematics, and with money, that they kind of reorganize the way how religions can become powerful. No? So this to me makes sense. But in order to classify or to put in profile the different religions, to name them, to say they were part of the axial age or not, one would have to be able to say precisely what they individually are. And I don't trust that this can be done in a way that would not be a figuring of it. So that would not itself already be invested. So I don't know exactly what the main claims are, but you are right that the notion of the axial age is best known for precisely this. So what they said, but I'm not sure if this is Jaspers himself or the receptions of the axial age, what they were very interested in at the time, and it had to do with the developments in mathematics. They were very interested in making a clear distinction between myth and fact, so myth and history. Because what you have in myth is a kind of a circularity. In myth, no, so you have, I mean, you have a kind of a genealogy of the gods, but whenever something doesn't add up systematically, then there is just a forgotten sibling. No, Zeus had a brother or whatever, and then it can be made to go round again. So myth is a kind of a transformative space, which would make impossible to actually do history. So this is something that was very virulent in the 19th century in Romanticism. That's why in Romanticism, you have an enormous, strong emphasis on archetypes. Not only in psychoanalysis, where you have Oedipus and you have Electra and all these figures. You have it in Nietzsche, is full of archetypes. So archetypes were a kind of a substitute, like a mythological now, not mythic, but mythological substitute for the religious figures like Christ or whatever the testaments would depict. So mythological in the sense, being more literate, more poetic, not so dogmatic. So that's what they were looking for. And this reasoning with the archetype and then the variation of them, it goes in parallel, let's say, to the algebra that changed mathematics in the 19th century. So algebra, as you know, that's why it's so important with respect to myth. Algebra is the mathematics of equations, and an equation in principle is an identity. No? It's an identity which you don't exhaustively know. So in an equation, there are things that you don't know about this identity. But the question has always been, well, is then in mathematics, is it about tautologies? No? Are mathematical truths outside of time? Are they timeless, and are they tautologies? So is it the ideal things that the world mirrors somehow? But this is only if we purify algebra against geometry and against arithmetic, and against how language can explain and translate between them. These were the questions that were in all the discourses around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. That's why in philosophy, this period was called the foundational wars, no, around these questions. Because with mathematics, we have science, we have industrialization, we have progress, we have secular technology, whereas with history and with projects, basically, with social reform, we need to have a notion of embodiment, of temporality. And there was one text about which Wittgenstein actually wrote a lot. It was called the Golden Bow. The Golden Bow, which studied anthropologically the different stories that many cultures would tell, no? Regardless whether they call it a testament or a testimony or whether it's a myth or whether it's just a legend. Regardless of that, he began to treat them all as literary documents and studied its structures. And its output was that the story of the birth of Christ is a myth, like all the other stories as well. And this created a huge outrage. No? So for many reasons that are now, of course, much too complex to go into, but that was not acceptable. And the thesis of the axial age was a kind of a proposal to remain undecided, or to remain of a divided mind, if you want, as a society with regard to this question. So if you say it's just a myth like all the others, you're like a reformer, or perhaps also a revolutionary, or a kind of a secular person, with which you offend people who practice their faith. And the axial age said, well, there is a reason why different religions co-emerged, and we can agree on that reason. And we can leave it undecided what the meaning of the different schools is. In my understanding, this was one of the key ambitions, actually, that Jaspers proposed. So to say there is a kind of a common nature of human, which we can learn to think through this concept of an axial age. Because it allows us to basically, to a certain extent, treat the question of religion as a private and an individual thing. So and it's in my understanding, it's part of the problem of the thesis as well, because it makes room for this for such an analytical construction of the social questions that come with it.
Thank you very much. That answered my question, and even more than answered. Thank you very much.
There is maybe one more with regard to this. There is one more book I didn't include in the lecture, but it's a very important one. It's by it's called Der Untergang des Abendlandes. It's by Spengler. Untergang des Abendlandes. It's by Oswald Spengler, and the Golden Bow is by Fraser. James George Fraser is the author of the Golden Bow. This was one of the key references next to the axial age. And Oswald Spengler, Der Untergang des Abendlandes. And what Oswald Spengler does is something that is he's really thinking towards a kind of a morphology of social forms. So he says the West is in decline because the globe as a whole can now construct itself in the image of the West, basically. So this was this is the troubling message that he postulated with regard to such social construction. And if we have this Cartesian space with an origin, and then we have a superiority of one culture in pushing these developments, and the superiority not in terms of subtlety or intellect or truth, but simply of factual power, which the West clearly has, no? With all the scientific progress that produces globalization now. if we treat this analytically, this gets very ugly. Ethically, morally, culturally, very ugly. So these topics are really not innocent. They're not abstract speculations, but they're also, we can't just put them away because because they are constituted by abstractions, new abstractions, like the new abstractions we are trying to get to terms with today. They are virulent, they're there. So Oswald Spengler, but then the axial age is the most digestible. It doesn't capture one so immediately. So the book by Oswald Spengler, for example, is very complicated to read because it's so strong. So if you're intellect, it's one of the very few books which really addresses this issue with mathematics and progress and secularity and science. It just names these things, it describes them, which is very rare, and it's very precious to be able to have a place to read about that. But at the same time, the optics it does is totally corrupting because it has this strong orientation. So the book I never recommend it. I think it's like a kind of a powerful thing. One must know it's there, but beware.
Don't read it. It's very dangerous and dark. So it's super convincing in its way. It's very dark, and it's like a dark hole for your mind. If you're not super educated and stable in your thinking, it's a black hole. So don't touch it. It's toxic. Yeah, it's really bad. The same with Jaspers and the axial age. I would say to liberate these things from all this analytic capturing of all this storytelling and in historical lines. So and getting some necessity out of these things. So for the next steps or make predictions of that and so on, getting out of that. And all the fascists doing that. So that's a problem with this. So to get out of it, I think, and there are a lot of arguments for that, and I can have another lecture for that easily, that the axial age is just the evolvement of, if we are in the metaphors of the lines filled with white lines, of the space with white lines. So the space was filled with white lines, and this got a globalization, a birth of globalization, like globalization today with the space full of the imaginary. Or in Renaissance with the globalization there, it's a birth of globalization because people learned to talk, to think, to act according to the scale of space of colors. And I think it's just the space of white lines established in that time. And it's a kind of globalization, and then you get different resonances in different cultures. In this case, it's a resonance towards monotheistic religions, for example, or towards a certain kind of phonetic writing, or at least mathematical principal theoretical mathematics coming up in all over the world in all cultures in different colors. And I would. Yeah, I like this idea that we can learn from that by anticipating that the challenge of this new scale is very similar to the challenge of our new scale we experience today. And then you don't need a historical line and a necessity, and then you simply say, okay, they had been puzzled, we are puzzled, but now start to talk. What can we learn from that? But there's no solution and there's no real problem. You can't grasp it. It's just another kind of weather all around, and all cultures are exposed to this. So there's no solution for it. It's just a challenge like a storm or whatever, or another temperature, another principled humidity. And there's no way out of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
All these are dangerous books. Don't touch them.
Yeah, true, yeah. And but the point is that they're powerful and they're dangerous because they open up an analytic domain with regard to psychic and social and historical things. And the analytics then goes in terms of finding criteria to legitimate necessary next steps. So that's the problem of it. When we say, in it, we can learn to craft instruments, like musical instruments. No, music, if we say music is, so history is like music. We can learn to play accordingly, no, but also challengingly and so on. So then there is a level where this analytics can, it is not on the level of determining or defining its object, but figuring it out. And the analytics goes into the instruments with which things can be figured out. So it becomes rhetorical and mechanical and artifice, or artifice, it's in German there is this word, das Können. Not etwas können, not a transitive, not a transitive ability, but an ability that you develop, an ability to cook well, an ability to read well, to whatever it is, no? An ability that is a kind of a self-referentially informative. And of course it produces things. So of course there are artifacts that fall off in which it exhausts itself, but they're not the purpose of it. But the purpose is a kind of a, yeah, sub specie bonum. So wanting to do good, yes, but not knowing how and what.
A very just about these the abilities, the canon, that's canon. And I think with our studio, we want to go in this direction and mimic like that. So the key challenge we have is that everything is kind of like this, like there. So we're with these machines and whatever. So all colors, all sounds, and all resolution, just like there. So and this get a little, and then you even can make your decision by saying, yeah, people in your situation have a building like that, and then you say, oh, that's nice, and bam, it's this. So everything is there. So getting out of this is what you say with the ability, that it's not the production itself what it's important. So there was in MIS some 10 years ago in our postgraduate studies, there was a Japanese student. So, and he made us kind of his first years in the office, and because it was complicated with traffic, so he always slept underneath the table, and over day he worked on top of the table, and he slept underneath, and so he was super precious in working with things. So and made beautiful drawings and paper folds, and so everything was beautiful. So then once he explained how he worked all these days on the table, when he slept under the table because he had no time, and what he did. So, and what they did is with the client, so with these small tiny houses, the house was there. The client would have a renovation of it, or kind of refurbishment, so some 60 square meters. So then it took 2 or 3 years, him fully involved in it with his chef, chef architect pushing him. So just to prepare the next talk with the client, and there was weekly talk with the client for 2 or 3 hours, and he prepared certain things, models, samples of certain materials and so on. And then they decided where to present it, where to go, whether in their office or in the park or in the train station, in this hall, where to prepare it. So, and then they discussed the curvature of the wood at the bench of the window, and they get these and that and so on. And at the end, then they did it 100 times. 100 times a week, so 2 years, 3 years, talking about all these details to do almost nothing at the end. And the beauty is everything got so sophisticated by that and loaded with meaning, and the customer was happy. Of course they are happy. They know everything about this and why they did these and that, what it might be, and so on. And that's, I think, is a way out of this super performance with things, just to load it with meaning, with stories, and so on, and almost doing nothing. Yeah. And I love this story and this experience of this small Japanese colleague doing nothing but architecture. And this was doing almost, it's just 12, 16 hours a day, so 340, 350 days a year in this room, just following this story for this one client to do almost nothing. But that's amazing. And then seeing how he is able to hold his pencil, to make a line, how to fold a paper, which kind of paper he's looking for, and breathtaking. So, and I think this is a lot of this principal skill to overcome this athletic burst of technological production. That's a way out. And it's a cognitive thing. So it's about being able to tell something, to know something, to be able to do something, and so on. Loaded with stories and with meaning.
I can show you again one slide I left out, but it fits very nicely to this. It's this one here. It's a text which is entitled Cosmic Etiology and Demiurgic Mimesis in Proclus' account of prayer. So this kind of können, which is no, so I mean, why would one do it if not to be productive? No, it's not to be fertile. It has something to do with cultivating a culture of the mind, no? So of mentality, let's say, that one's feelings and thoughts don't dominate. So they're not immediately true what they convey, but one has an active, a cultivated way of relating to it. And this text is interesting because it says the demiurg, no? The demiurg is the public worker, literally. So demos and urgos is das Werk. So it's not the architect directly, it's the architect as a worker who exhausts himself for service public. This is the literal meaning of the demiurg. So then if mimesis is not trying to copy nature, but trying to become like, to develop a likeness that is demiurgic. No, you have this, it's a reference image for this kind of können. No? So to in principle be able to do, but not necessarily do it. And then the demiurg it doesn't just create a world, it creates a cosmos, and the cosmos is ornate. So that's why cosmetics has the same word. It's the adorned face. So it's the face of the world praised as a beautiful one. So that's a complicated story why beauty has something then to do with being in good proportion. That means being harmonical, also pleasant, but also so the whole complexity, the moral complexity of beauty is in there, and the demiurg contemplates how to do that without having a model for it. No, so that's the thing. It's an open game, and this text now it gives a very interesting reading of how Proclus was, I think, the 2nd century before Christ. He counts as a Neoplatonist, but is very early in this tradition because it's before Christianity, in the 2nd century. But what he read, it was like a kind of an syncretism between Platonic thinking, Aristotelian thinking, so metaphysics, and emerging cults in Christianity. And he had them all coexist. And for him, he called this kind of das Können üben as a form of prayer in mimicking demiurgic public service of how to make a cosmos. And you see, this is in principle, all the elements which we are today, nobody would say the architect is a demiurg and the house is a miniature of the cosmos, because we feel this is a colonial gesture of a hubris gesture. But there are so many ways in reading the constellation of these terms. It's not about going for one straight line or refusing it. No, it's about handling it with subtlety. And if we include this play of a cipher and the coding with respect to the world, there is not that much left of this colonialism, which we are skeptical about. Maybe there is a passage, yeah, here he describes. So the point is, so Proclus says the demiurge is the one who creates by virtue of an internalization of the invisible causes of the universe. He says, so the ascent of prayer, as in prayer, we become like the demiurge. No, and here, interesting, the prayer and rhetorics, but of course, no, I mean, I don't know, but this would be something really interesting to study how is giving a service in theology different from rhetorics, no, which would be in public. So what are there the nuances? Very interesting with respect to coding. To rendering pictures, to pick up and to retell markup languages, all of the terms in which we describe digital literacy, they circle around these things in a new kind of way. World games, gamification, so it's always about the whole world again now. But how to think of this?
Good, huh? Thank you, Vera. Now we make a break, 15 minutes, huh? No, half past, we meet again to sum up this day and go to pragmatics tomorrow.
Thank you, Vera. Thank you.
Thank you.